We forge bars from our fear and call it order. But when darkness stares you in the eye, you realize the true beast lives not in the cage, but in the heart of the one holding the key. The air down here did not smell like magic. It smelled of wet fur, iron, and the sour, cloying stench of fear that had gone stale. Hermione Granger adjusted the collar of her robes, the stiff fabric scratching against the damp skin of her neck. She stood at the edge of the viewing platform, hidden in the shadows of a crumbling stone pillar. Below, the roar of the crowd was a physical weight, a vibration that rattled her teeth and settled deep in her chest. This was the pit, an open secret in the dark underbelly of magical London, a place the Ministry had spent months pretending didn't exist until the body count became too high to ignore. "Stay close, Granger," Aura Dawson muttered, his wand drawn, the tip glowing with a faint, nervous light. "We're just here for recon. Verify the rumors, identify the ringleaders. No heroics." "I know the protocol, Dawson," Hermione replied, her voice barely a whisper. She kept her eyes fixed on the arena below. It was a crude circle of packed dirt and dried blood, surrounded by rusted iron bars etched with suppression runes. The magic radiating from the cage was sickly, a distorted yellow pulse that tasted like battery acid on her tongue. She hated this. She hated the way the war had supposedly ended, yet the darkness had simply changed shape. It had seeped into the cracks of society, festering in places like this, where wealthy wizards in velvet cloaks threw galleons at the spectacle of suffering. A gate on the far side of the arena groaned open with the shriek of metal on stone. The crowd surged forward, their voices rising in a feverish chant. "Beast! Beast! Beast!" Hermione felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She expected a troll, perhaps an illegally imported Riem. Instead, a man walked out. He moved with a fluid, predatory grace that was entirely unhuman, his spine curved slightly, as if the weight of the air was too heavy to bear. He was stripped to the waist, his skin a roadmap of violence. Pale flesh was marred by long, jagged ridges of scar tissue, claw marks that raked down his back, bite marks on his shoulders that had healed into twisted knots. He was lean, dangerously so, his ribs visible beneath the taut skin, but the muscles that corded his arms were hard, built from desperation. He stopped in the center of the ring, keeping his head low. His hair was matted, hanging in dirty, white-blonde strings that obscured his face. Hermione's breath hitched. The color, that specific, impossible shade of platinum. "No," she breathed, the word dissolving before it left her lips. The opponent entered from the opposite gate, a massive wizard, hulking and fortified with illegal strength potions, wielding a spiked flail. The crowd screamed for blood. The wizard roared, swinging the weapon. The pale man didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his hands. He just stood there, vibrating with a chaotic, restrained energy. When the flail came down, the man didn't dodge like a duelist. He moved like smoke. He dropped to all fours, his body contorting at an angle that should have snapped bone, and lunged. It was too fast for the human eye to track comfortably. One moment he was on the ground. The next, he was on the wizard's back. There was no magic used, no wand, just the brutal, sickening crack of impact. The pale man's fingers, filthy and tipped with nails that looked too sharp, too hard, dug into the wizard's pressure points. The giant crumbled. Silence fell over the arena, sudden and absolute, followed immediately by the deafening sound of coin purses being emptied and bets being settled. The victor stood over the unconscious body. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. Slowly, he turned his head toward the viewing platform, as if he could smell the intruders through the wards. He lifted his face. Hermione felt the floor drop out from under her. The world narrowed down to the pinpoint of those eyes. They were grey, cold as winter rain, but framed by red-rimmed exhaustion and something feral. Draco Malfoy, dead. He was supposed to be dead, or missing. The report had been filed 3 years ago. Draco Malfoy disappeared following the seizure of Malfoy Manor. Presumed fled. Case closed. He wasn't fled. He was here. He looked directly at her. There was no way he could see her through the disillusionment charms, through the shadows, across the distance of the crowded pit. But he looked right at her. There was no recognition in his eyes, only a hollow, terrifying awareness. He didn't look like a man who wanted to be saved. He looked like an animal that knew it was cornered. "Target identified," Dawson whispered beside her, oblivious to her paralysis. "That's the champion. Looks like a werewolf bite on the shoulder. Unregistered. That's a Class X offense. We can tag him for the creature division." "He's not a creature," Hermione snapped, the vibration of her own voice startling her. "That is a human being." "Look at him, Granger," Dawson scoffed, pointing his wand. "There's nothing human left in that cage. He's the weapon. We neutralize him, we shut the place down." Hermione looked back at the arena. 2 handlers were entering the ring now, wielding long poles tipped with electrified prods. They approached Malfoy cautiously, fear evident in their posture. Malfoy didn't back away. He stood his ground, a low rumble building in his chest, a sound that was too deep, too guttural to be a human growl. One of the handlers jabbed the prod into Malfoy's side. Blue sparks flew. Malfoy's body seized, his back arching in a spasm of agony, but he didn't scream. He just took it. He took it as if pain was the only language he understood anymore. When the current stopped, he slumped, panting, and allowed them to shackle his wrists with heavy, rune-carved iron. The sight of the chains tore something open inside Hermione. It wasn't pity. Pity was soft. Pity was for things that were weak. This was horror. It was the sudden, violent realization that the world she had fought to save was capable of eating its own children. "We wait for the backup team," Dawson instructed, checking his pocket watch. "Then we raid. The beast goes to control for processing. Likely execution given the aggression levels." Processing. Execution. Hermione watched Malfoy being dragged toward the dark tunnel, his bare feet leaving bloody prints in the dust. He looked back one last time, not at the crowd, at the darkness where she stood. His expression was void. He had accepted his fate. He was the monster in the cage, and monsters didn't get happy endings. They got put down. A memory flashed through her mind. The drawing room at the manor. Malfoy, years ago, terrified and pale, refusing to identify her. "I'm not sure," he had said. A small, cowardly mercy, but a mercy nonetheless. He hadn't spoken then to save her. She couldn't speak now to save him. Words wouldn't work here. The ministry machine would chew him up. If Dawson filed that report, Malfoy became a statistic, a dangerous half-breed to be liquidated. Hermione's hand moved to her wand. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was treason, or at least a career-ending violation of about 40 different laws. "Granger, where are you going?" Dawson hissed. Getting a better angle, she lied. She stepped away from the pillar, moving toward the edge of the balcony. The drop was 30 feet. She didn't think. If she thought, she would remember she was the deputy head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. She would remember logic. She would remember that Malfoy had been a bully, a prejudice-filled bigot, a Death Eater. But all she saw was the chain. All she saw was the blood on his back. Hermione vaulted over the railing. The wind rushed past her ears, and she cast a cushioning charm seconds before she hit the dirt of the arena floor. The impact jarred her knees, kicking up a cloud of dust. The crowd went silent. The handlers froze. Malfoy stopped. He turned slowly, the heavy chains rattling. Hermione stood up, her wand raised. She wasn't pointing it at him. She was pointing it at the handlers. "Step away from him," she commanded. Her voice was clear, ringing with the authority she had spent years cultivating. "Now." The handlers exchanged confused glances. "Ministry business, love. You're interrupting the show." "I am the Ministry," Hermione said, her eyes flashing. "And this show is over." Malfoy didn't move. He stared at her, his head tilted to the side, his nostrils flaring slightly as he took in her scent. There was no relief on his face, no gratitude. His lip curled back to reveal teeth that looked sharper than she remembered. "Granger," he rasped. His voice was a ruin, unused, scratchy, like grinding stones. "You always did have terrible timing." "Shut up, Malfoy," she said, stepping closer, placing herself between him and the handlers. The air between them crackled with static electricity. She could feel the heat radiating off him, a feverish, unnatural warmth. "They'll kill you," he said softly. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact. "Leave." "No." The handlers recovered their wits. One raised his shock prod, grinning. "Little witch wants to play with the wolf. Let's see how she handles the voltage." He lunged. Hermione didn't flinch. She slashed her wand through the air. "Confringo!" The ground beneath the handler exploded, sending him flying backward into the stone wall. The crowd screamed, panic finally setting in as the realization of a raid took hold. Chaos erupted. Spectators scrambled for the exits, trampling each other in the dark. "Dawson!" Hermione shouted into the chaos, knowing he couldn't hear her. "Secure the exits!" She turned to Draco. He was watching the violence with a detached curiosity. "We have to go," she said, reaching for his arm. He flinched. It was a violent, full-body recoil. He snarled, a low, dangerous sound, and jerked away from her hand. "Do not," he growled, his eyes flashing amber. "Touch me." "I can't apparate us if I don't touch you," she yelled over the noise of the stampede. "I didn't ask you to apparate me," he spat. "I didn't ask for anything." "I don't care what you asked for." Hermione grabbed the front of his chains, the cold iron biting into her palms. She yanked him forward, forcing him to look at her. They were inches apart. She could see the grime in his paws, the broken capillaries in his eyes. She could smell the blood and the musk of the wolf. "I am not leaving you in a cage. Do you understand? I am not doing it." Draco stared at her. For a second, the mask slipped. The feral aggression wavered, revealing a terrifying, bottomless exhaustion. He looked at her hand gripping his chains, then up at her face. "You're making a mistake," he whispered. "Probably," she said. She gripped his forearm, ignoring the way his muscles bunched, hard as rock beneath her fingers. She spun on her heel. The world twisted. The sounds of the arena, The screaming crowd, the crack of spells, the smell of fear were sucked away into the vacuum of apparition. They were gone. But as the darkness pressed in against her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs, Hermione had the distinct, chilling thought that she hadn't just saved a man. She had invited a predator into her life, and she had no idea how she was going to survive him. The arrival was not a landing. It was a collision with reality. They hit the floorboards of the safe house with a bone-jarring impact that knocked the wind out of Hermione. The sensation of sidelong apparition with a struggling, unwilling passenger felt less like travel and more like being torn apart and hastily stitched back together. She rolled onto her side, gasping, her lungs burning as they tried to adjust to the sudden shift in pressure. The air here was freezing. It didn't smell of blood and sweat anymore. It smelled of salt spray, damp wood, and dust that had settled undisturbed for years. A low, guttural sound from the corner of the room snapped her attention back to the present. Draco. He had landed on his knees, his body hunched over, retching. The magical transport had clearly wreaked havoc on his physiology, already pushed to the brink by the combat drugs and the transformation. But even in his sickness, the predatory instinct was the first thing to recover. His head snapped up. His eyes, dilated and frantic, swept the room in a fraction of a second. No bars, no sand, just peeling wallpaper, boarded up windows, and the terrifying expanse of an open room. He lunged. It wasn't a conscious attack. It was a reflex. He scrambled backward, his heels scraping against the wood, seeking a wall, a corner, anything solid to put behind his back. "Malfoy, stop!" Hermione scrambled to her feet, her wand raised. Her hand was shaking. The adrenaline that had carried her out of the arena was curdling into cold, hard fear. He didn't hear her, or he didn't care. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving with ragged, wet breaths. His eyes were fixed on the door, gauging the distance. "Colloportus," Hermione whispered, sealing the heavy oak door. "Muffliato, protego totalum." The wards shimmered into place, sealing them inside the small coastal cottage. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the howling of the wind outside and the harsh rasp of Draco's breathing. He turned his gaze on her. In the dim light of the single oil lamp she had managed to ignite with a flick of her wand, he looked like a nightmare. The grime of the arena was plastered to his skin, a second skin of filth and dried blood. The iron shackles were still around his wrists, the broken chain dangling uselessly. He looked at the door, then back at her. A slow, cruel sneer twisted his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes remained dead. "A cage with a view," he rasped, his voice cracking on the syllables. He slumped back against the wall, pulling his knees to his chest, but his muscles remained coiled, ready to spring. "How benevolent of you, Granger." "You were going to be executed," Hermione said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her legs. She kept her distance, hugging the opposite wall. "The Ministry raid. Dawson would have filed you as a creature. You know what they do to unregistered werewolves in underground fighting rings. And you think this is better?" He spat the words. He lifted his shackled hands, the chains clattering loudly in the empty room. "You didn't save me. You just stole me. I'm just property. The ownership has changed." "I am not your owner," she snapped, stung. "I'm trying to help you." Help? He laughed, a dry, barking sound that held zero humor. You dragged me out of a hole where I knew the rules, and you dropped me into... What is this? A safe house? A prison? You think because you took me out of the pit, I'm suddenly going to sit up and beg? I think, Hermione said, stepping forward cautiously, that you are bleeding, and you're going into shock. She took another step. Draco reacted instantly. He bared his teeth, a flash of white in the gloom, and a low growl vibrated in his throat. It wasn't human. It was the warning of a wild animal protecting a wound. Stay back, he warned. The articulation was difficult for him, as if his jaw was fighting the shape of human words. I haven't eaten in 2 days, Granger, and you smell very alive. Hermione froze. The threat hung in the air, visceral and terrifying. She looked at him, really looked at him. The show muscles were there, yes, but beneath them he was gaunt. His skin was greyish pale, feverish. The bite on his shoulder, the original curse mark, was inflamed, surrounded by fresh claw marks from the fights. He was dying, slowly, rotting from the inside out. I have potions, she said quietly, refusing to back down, though every instinct screamed at her to run. Analgesics, blood replenishers, and a calming draught. I don't want your pity, he hissed, closing his eyes and leaning his head back against the peeling wallpaper. I want you to unlock the door and let me walk into the ocean. No. He opened one eye. No? No, Hermione repeated, her Gryffindor stubbornness finally finding its footing. I didn't blow up my career and assault a ministry team just to let you commit suicide 10 minutes later. You're going to let me heal you. And if I kill you? He asked softly. When the fever spikes? When the wolf decides it doesn't like the smell of your fear? Then I suppose I'll be the idiot who died trying, she said. She moved before she could talk herself out of it. She crossed the room, kneeling a few feet away from him. She set her beaded bag on the floor and began pulling out vials. The clinking of glass was the only sound. Draco watched her. He didn't move to attack, but he tracked her hands with an intensity that made the hair on her arms stand up. He was waiting for a mistake. Give me your arm, she said, uncorking a bottle of dittany. He didn't move. Malfoy, the cut on your forearm is infected. If the infection hits your bloodstream with your lycanthropy, it will kill you faster than the ministry could. Slowly, agonizingly, he extended his left arm. The dark mark was there, faded, scarred over, but visible beneath the dirt. But it was crossed out. A jagged, ugly scar ran directly through the snake and skull, as if someone had tried to carve it out with a dull knife. Hermione's breath hitched, but she said nothing. She poured the dittany onto a cloth and reached out. The moment her skin brushed his, he flinched so violently he nearly knocked the bottle from her hand. His skin was burning hot, a furnace of fever. Don't, he choked out, pulling his arm back against his chest. His breathing hitched. Don't touch me like that. Like what? Hermione asked, her hand hovering in the air. Like I'm human, he whispered. The aggression drained out of him for a second, replaced by a bleak, crushing shame. He looked away, staring at the floorboards. It confuses the instincts. It makes the beast agitated. You are human, Draco, she said firmly. He looked at her then, and the expression on his face broke her heart. It was a look of profound, exhausted disbelief. You have no idea what I am, he said. You saw me in the ring. You saw what I did to that man. I didn't use a wand, Granger. I tore his throat out with my hands. I liked it. I liked the taste of it." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Do you understand? The wolf isn't a curse anymore. It's the only part of me that makes sense." Hermione didn't pull away. She forced herself to hold his gaze. "I saw a man surviving. I saw a system that forced him to become a monster to stay alive. I don't judge you for surviving, Draco." He stared at her for a long moment, searching for the lie. When he didn't find it, he looked confused. And then the walls slammed back up. "Just fix the arm," he muttered, turning his face away. "And then get away from me." Hermione worked in silence. She cleaned the wound, the smell of antiseptic cutting through the musk of the room. She applied the essence of dittany, watching the skin knit together. She bandaged it with trembling fingers. Every time she moved, he tensed. Every time she shifted her weight, his eyes darted to her throat, then away. It was a dance of predator and prey, enacted in a 3-foot radius. When she finished, she sat back on her heels. "I need to secure you," she said quietly. Draco let out a harsh breath. "Back to the chains. I told you." "It's for my safety," she said, hating the words as they left her mouth. "And yours. If you attack me, I'll have to stun you. I don't want to fight you." She pointed her wand at a heavy iron pipe that ran along the base of the wall, part of the old heating system. With a complex transfiguration spell, she extended the chain from his manacles and fused it to the pipe. It gave him enough length to stand, to sit, to lie down, but not enough to reach the door, or her if she stood on the other side of the room. Draco tested the chain. He gave it a sharp tug, the metal clinking. He looked at it with a strange mixture of hatred and relief. The cage was familiar. The cage made sense. Freedom was the variable he couldn't handle. "Comfortable?" she asked, her voice hollow. "At home," he replied darkly. Hermione stood up, dusting off her knees. She felt drained, her magical core aching from the apparition and the wards. She walked to the far side of the room, near the fireplace, and conjured a simple cot for herself. "I'm going to sleep," she announced. "The wards will alert me if anyone approaches within a mile. There's food and water within your reach." She lay down, keeping her wand in her hand, facing him. Draco didn't eat. He didn't drink. He curled up on the bare floorboards, wrapping his arms around himself, his back to her. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was charged, electric, with the tension of two people who were technically on the same side, yet worlds apart. Hermione watched the rise and fall of his shoulders in the dim light. She thought about the life she had left behind only hours ago. The warm office, the paperwork, the planned dinner with Ginny. It felt like a dream. This, the cold, the smell of damp wool and wolf, the rhythmic clinking of a chain. This was her reality now. "Granger." His voice was small, barely a whisper from the shadows. "Yes." "Why?" One word, loaded with 3 years of absence, with the weight of his crimes, with the impossibility of her presence. "Because," Hermione whispered back, staring at the ceiling, "no one deserves to be forgotten in the dark." Draco didn't answer. Outside, the storm finally broke, rain lashing against the boarded windows like gravel. Inside, the candle flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. Hermione didn't sleep. She listened to the breathing of the beast across the room and wondered if she would survive the night. Not because he would kill her, but because seeing him like this, broken, feral, and utterly alone, was a pain she hadn't prepared for. In the dark, she heard him move, the slide of fabric on wood, then a soft, wet sound. He was lapping water from the bowl she had left on the floor, like a dog. Hermione closed her eyes and pressed her fist against her mouth to stifle a sob. The sound of his degradation filled the room, louder than the storm, louder than her own heart. She lay there, bearing witness to his shame, and promised herself that if they made it out of this, she would burn the entire world that had done this to him. Dawn did not break. It bruised the horizon. The light that filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows was the color of a healing hematoma, sullen purples and sickly greys. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy, pressing against Hermione's eardrums. But inside the safe house, the silence was perforated by a rhythmic, metallic shivering. Clink, clink, clink. Hermione sat up on her conjured cot, every muscle in her body aching from the tension of the night. She looked across the room. Draco was dying, or at least his body was trying to tear itself apart. The adrenaline of the escape had burned off, and now the withdrawal was setting in. The illegal combat stimulants, the mixtures used to force transformations, to dull pain, to induce rage, were leaving his system. The result was catastrophic. He was curled into a tight ball against the base of the wall, his knees drawn up to his chin. His skin, which had been pale yesterday, was now a translucent, waxy grey. He was soaked in sweat, shivering so violently that the chain connecting his wrist to the pipe rattled incessantly. Hermione stood up, the floorboards groaning under her feet. "Stay back!" he gasped. The words were barely intelligible, torn from a throat raw with bile. He didn't open his eyes. He couldn't. "I need to check your temperature," Hermione said, her voice steady, though her stomach turned at the sight of him. This wasn't the arrogant boy from the school corridors. This was a heap of raw nerve endings and trauma. "Don't," he wheezed, a spasm wrecking his frame. He coughed, a wet, hacking sound that brought up nothing but dry heaves. "Let it finish." "Let what finish?" "The rot." Hermione ignored him. She crossed the room, stepping into the circle of his misery. The smell hit her first, acrid sweat, old blood, and the chemical sweetness of dark potions sweating out of his pores. It was repulsive, visceral. It was the smell of a cage. She knelt beside him. He flinched, trying to scramble backward, but the walls stopped him. His eyes cracked open, unfocused and glassy, the pupils blown wide. "You're burning up," she murmured, reaching out. He slapped her hand away. The blow was weak, uncoordinated, but the intent was clear. "Do not touch." "Stop being an idiot, Malfoy," she snapped, her patience fraying under the weight of her own fear. "You are going into withdrawal. If your fever spikes any higher, it will cook your brain. Do you want to die here, on a dusty floor in the middle of nowhere?" "Yes," he whispered. The honesty of it was a physical blow. He let his head thud back against the wall, his chest heaving. "Better here than the pit." Hermione gritted her teeth. She summoned a basin of cool water and a clean cloth. "Well, I don't accept that. I didn't drag you out of hell just to watch you give up because you're uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable?" A hysterical, broken laugh bubbled up in his chest, turning into a choke. "My blood is boiling, Granger. My bones feel like they're liquefying." "I know," she said, softer this time. She dipped the cloth into the water, wringing it out. I know. It's the berserker draft, isn't it? And whatever they used to suppress the transformation between fights. He didn't answer, but the tension around his eyes tightened. I'm going to cool you down, she announced, giving him a second to prepare. She pressed the cold cloth to his forehead. He hissed, his back arching off the floor, a low, animalistic whine escaping his lips. It was a sound of pure sensory overload. But he didn't strike her. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hands clenching into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. Hermione worked methodically. She wiped his face, his neck. She moved down to his chest, cleaning away the grime of the arena. As the dirt cleared, the map of his suffering became sharper. It wasn't just the claw marks. It was the other things. The burns, the thin white lines of knife work. And there, just below his collarbone, a brand. It wasn't the dark mark. It was a rune. Possession. Obedience. Burned into the skin, angry and red. Hermione's hand faltered. She stared at the brand, feeling a wave of nausea. The Ministry knew about these places. They knew. And they let them run because the victims were undesirables. Pretty, isn't it? Draco rasped. He was watching her now, his gaze lucid for a fleeting second. That one costs extra. The crowd likes to know. The beast is broken. They didn't break you, Hermione whispered, dipping the cloth back into the water to hide the trembling of her hands. Didn't they? He looked at his own hands, scarred and trembling. I don't know how to be anything else anymore, Granger. I don't remember how to be a person. You're talking to me, she said. That's a start. I'm warning you, he corrected. There is a difference. The day bled into a long, agonizing blur. The fever peaked around noon. Draco became delirious, thrashing against the chains, shouting commands to invisible handlers, begging for the noise to stop. Hermione didn't leave his side. She pinned his shoulders down when he tried to claw at his own skin. She forced potions down his throat, nutrient potions, fever reducers, soothing him with a constant stream of nonsense words, just to keep a human sound in the air. It's okay, she murmured, over and over as he shuddered beneath her hands. You're safe. No one is coming. The gate is closed. Eventually, the potions took hold. The violent shaking subsided into a subtle tremor. His breathing evened out, no longer a desperate gasp for air, but a rhythmic, exhausted rasp. The sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. The air grew colder, biting at the dampness of their clothes. Hermione retreated to her cot, exhausted. She sat with her back against the wall, hugging her knees. She felt hollowed out. She had seen war. She had seen death. But this slow, systematic dismantling of a human soul was a different kind of horror. She looked at him. He was lying on his side, facing her, his eyes half open. The fever had broken, leaving him pale and gaunt, looking more like a corpse than a man. Why are you still here? The voice was faint, stripped of its usual sneer. Hermione blinked, pulled from her thoughts. The door is locked, Malfoy. Where would I go? You could leave, he said. Unlock the wards. Leave me the key. I wouldn't stop you. I know. Then why? She looked down at her hands. Because you're not a beast, Draco. No matter how much they tried to make you one. And I'm not going to leave you alone until you believe that. He watched her for a long time. The grey of his eyes was dark, unreadable in the gloom. He looked like he wanted to argue, to spew venom, to push her away again. But he didn't have the energy. "Read something," he said suddenly. Hermione looked up, surprised. "What?" "The silence," he murmured, closing his eyes. "It's too loud. It sounds like waiting. Read something. Anything." Hermione hesitated, then reached into her beaded bag. She pulled out the only book she had, a battered copy of the Tales of Beedle the Bard she had grabbed for comfort, a relic from a simpler time. She opened it to a random page. The light was fading, so she cast a small lumos, the orb of light hovering between them like a fragile star. There was once a kindly old wizard who used his magic generously and wisely for the benefit of his neighbors. She began, her voice soft, filling the empty, cold space of the room. She read. She read about hopping pots and fountains of fair fortune. Silly, children's stories. Stories from a world where magic was whimsical, not a weapon. Draco didn't move. He lay perfectly still, the chains slack on the floor. As she read, she watched him. Slowly, very slowly, the tension began to drain from his frame. The furrow between his brows smoothed out. His hand, which had been clenched near his chest, relaxed, the fingers uncurling against the wooden floor. And then she saw it. He shifted. He turned his head slightly, pressing his cheek into the rough wood of the floor. He exposed his neck. It was a small thing, a trivial thing. But for a creature, for a man who had spent 3 years guarding his throat from teeth and blades, it was monumental. He was sleeping. He wasn't guarding himself. He wasn't waiting for the blow. For the first time in years, Draco Malfoy was simply asleep in the presence of another living being. Hermione stopped reading mid-sentence. The silence returned, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was fragile, precious. She looked at the pale curve of his exposed throat, the vulnerability of the pulse beating there. A strange, sharp ache bloomed in her chest. It wasn't pity. It was a fierce, protective anger at the world that had taught him he had to hide that pulse to survive. She extinguished the light, plunging the room into darkness. "Good night, Draco," she whispered to the dark. The only answer was the steady, rhythmic sound of his breathing and the wind howling outside, trying to get in. But for tonight, the cage was closed and the beast was sleeping. The morning brought a clarity that was sharper and crueler than the night. When Hermione woke, the room was bathed in a flat, grey light that exposed everything the shadows had hidden. It revealed the thick layer of dust on the mantel, the damp stains blooming on the ceiling like bruises, and the stark, undeniable reality of the man chained to the wall. Draco was awake. He was sitting with his back against the peeling wallpaper, his knees drawn up, staring at his hands. His hands were clean now. Hermione had scourgified the blood and grime away while he slept, but he looked at them as if they were still dripping red. He turned them over, examining the palms, the long fingers, the scars that crossed his knuckles. He flexed them, watching the tendons shift with a detached, morbid fascination. It was the way a man might look at a weapon he didn't know how to unload. Hermione sat up slowly, the creak of the cot sounding like a gunshot in the silence. Draco's head didn't snap up this time. He didn't flinch. He just stopped moving his hands, freezing in place like a statue. The aggression of the fever was gone, replaced by a hollow, crushing lethargy. "You're still here," he said. His voice was rough, a scrape of gravel, but the feral growl was subdued. "I told you I wasn't leaving," Hermione said, swinging her legs over the edge of the cot. She felt stiff, her own body protesting the sleeping conditions. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been hollowed out with a spoon," he murmured. He finally looked at her. His eyes were sunken, dark circles bruising the pale skin beneath them. The grey irises were dull, stripped of their usual icy bite. "The hunger is back." Hermione nodded, standing up. "I have food. Real food. Not whatever they gave you." She moved to the small kitchenette in the corner, busying her hands to hide the sudden spike of nervousness. The dynamic had shifted again. He wasn't the attacking beast, nor the delirious invalid. He was Draco Malfoy again, or the ghost of him, and that made the intimacy of their confinement significantly more difficult to navigate. She prepared a simple meal: toast, eggs, tea. The smell of cooking food filled the damp room, seemingly out of place, like a lie. It was too domestic for a cage. When she brought the plate to him, placing it on the floor within his reach, he stared at it with suspicion. "It's not poisoned, Draco," she said softly, sitting cross-legged a few feet away. He reached for the toast. His hand trembled, a fine, persistent tremor that he couldn't control. He brought the food to his mouth and ate slowly, carefully, as if relearning the mechanics of chewing. "They fed us raw meat," he said suddenly. He didn't look at her. He looked at the bread in his hand. "Once a day, thrown through the bars. If you didn't catch it, the others would steal it. You learn to eat fast. You learn not to taste it." Hermione felt the bile rise in her throat. She set her own cup of tea down, her appetite vanishing. "How long?" she asked. "How long were you there?" 8 months in London," he said. "Before that, 6 months in a cellar in Albania. Before that, I don't remember." "The report said you fled," Hermione said, her voice tight. "After the manor was seized, the ministry said you ran to avoid trial." Draco let out a dry, mirthless chuckle. "The ministry says what fits the paperwork, Granger." He dropped the crust of the toast onto the plate and leaned his head back, closing his eyes. The exhaustion on his face was ancient. "I didn't run. I was taken. A bounty hunter caught me 3 days after the Battle of Hogwarts. He thought he could sell me to the highest bidder." He paused, his jaw working. But then the bite happened. A botched job during the capture. Greyback's second in command. And suddenly, the heir to the Malfoy fortune wasn't worth a ransom anymore. I was damaged goods. Hermione stared at him, horror dawning on her like a cold sweat. "Lucius, Narcissa, they would have paid. They would have looked for you." Draco opened his eyes. He looked at her with a pitying expression, as if she were a naive child. "My father," he said quietly, "received a letter. The bounty hunter offered to sell me back, even with the condition. Do you know what Lucius replied?" Hermione shook her head, unable to speak. "He said, 'The house of Malfoy has no beasts. Do what you will with the animal.'" Draco's voice was devoid of emotion. It was a dead recitation of facts. "They didn't just stop looking, Granger. They erased me. A werewolf heir is a stain on the bloodline. Better to be dead than a half-breed." "That's..." Hermione gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's monstrous." "That's tradition," he corrected. "And the ministry. They knew. When I was sold to the arena, the registration papers were filed. Unknown male lycanthrope. But the magical signature was there. I saw the clerk. He looked right at me. He saw the Malfoy signet ring I was still wearing before they cut it off my finger." Draco looked at his left hand, at the faint white scar where a ring used to sit. He didn't file a report. He took a bribe from the arena master and burned the file. Because who cares about a Death Eater getting what he deserves? It was justice, wasn't it? No, Hermione whispered. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and angry. That is not justice. That is torture. That is... I am so sorry, Draco. Don't, he snapped. The apathy cracked, revealing a flash of sharp, jagged anger. Don't apologize for them, and don't look at me like I'm a victim. I killed people in that pit. I tore them apart. The first time, I hesitated. The second time, it was easier. By the 10th time, I stopped counting. He leaned forward, straining against the chain, his eyes burning into hers. I belong in a cage, Granger. The system works. It put a monster where it couldn't hurt good people like you. The only mistake was you thinking you could undo it. The system is broken, Hermione cried out, standing up. She couldn't sit anymore. The agitation was too great. She paced the small length of the room. If the Ministry did this, if they allowed this, then the whole thing is rot. I've spent 3 years trying to rebuild it, trying to make it fair, and all this time. She stopped in front of him, breathing hard. You are not a monster, Draco. You were a boy who made terrible choices, and then you were a victim of a war that never really ended. I will not let you believe that you deserve this. She knelt down again, ignoring his flinch. She reached out to check the bandage on his arm. Let me see, she commanded softly. Draco hesitated, then extended his arm. The defiance was draining out of him again, leaving him brittle. Hermione unwrapped the bandage. The wound was healing, the angry red edges turning pink. She placed her hand on his forearm, her fingers brushing against the dark mark, against the scars, against the fever-hot skin. The infection is gone, she murmured, her thumb tracing the line of a tendon. The silence in the room shifted. It became heavy, thick with something that wasn't fear and wasn't anger. Draco was watching her hand on his skin. He was staring at it with a kind of starving intensity. He hadn't been touched with kindness in years. Every hand that had touched him had been to hurt, to chain, or to goad. Hermione looked up. Their eyes met. For a second, the barriers were down. She saw the boy he used to be, buried under layers of trauma and grime. She saw the terrified teenager in the astronomy tower. And he saw her. Not the mudblood, not the enemy, but the only warm thing in a cold world. Draco leaned in. It was subtle, a fraction of an inch. His body, betraying his mind, sought the warmth of her. His head tilted slightly, as if he wanted to rest his cheek against her hand. His eyes fluttered shut, his breathing hitching. Hermione held her breath. She didn't move. She let him bridge the gap. His forehead almost brushed her shoulder. The air between them was charged, magnetic. The scent of him, rain, salt, and wolf, filled her senses. Then he froze. His eyes snapped open. The realization of what he was doing crashed into him. He jerked back as if she had burned him. He scrambled backward until his spine hit the wall with a dull thud, pulling his arm from her grasp. He curled in on himself, shielding his body, shielding his need. Don't, he rasped, his voice trembling. Don't do that. Do what? Hermione whispered, her hands still raised in the empty air. Don't pretend I'm human, Granger, he choked out, turning his face away, hiding his eyes from her. It makes it harder. Harder to what? Harder to remember what I am, he said. Harder to stay alive when you leave. Because you will leave, or they will come. And I can't. I can't afford to be soft. Soft things die in the cage. Hermione slowly lowered her hand. Her heart was aching in her chest, a dull, throbbing pain. I'm not pretending, she said firmly, and I'm not leaving. Draco didn't answer. He just pulled his knees to his chest and stared at the wall, rebuilding the fortress around himself, stone by stone. But Hermione noticed that his hand, the one she had touched, was resting over his heart, clutching the fabric of his shirt, as if trying to hold something inside that was threatening to break free. The wind outside picked up again, howling around the corners of the safe house. But inside, the storm was silent and far more devastating. Hermione went back to her side of the room, picked up her book, and sat vigil. She didn't read. She just watched him, and for the first time, she began to understand that saving Draco Malfoy wasn't going to be about fighting the Ministry. It was going to be about fighting him, to convince him that he was worth saving at all. The silence of the safe house was not peaceful. It was a held breath. Outside, the ocean churned against the cliffs, a rhythmic, crashing drumbeat that usually drowned out the world. But inside, the air had grown thin. Static electricity pricked at the skin on Hermione's arms, raising the fine hairs. The candle flame on the table didn't flicker. It stood perfectly straight, as if solidified in glass. Draco was the first to know. He had been dozing, or pretending to, curled on the floor with his back to the room. Suddenly, he went rigid. His spine locked. A low, vibrating sound started in his chest, too deep to be a groan, too quiet to be a roar. He sat up, his movements fluid and sharp, shedding the lethargy of the withdrawal like a heavy cloak. His nose twitched, inhaling the damp air. Granger, he whispered. The name was a warning. Hermione looked up from her book, her hand instantly going to her wand. What is it? They're here. Who? The Ministry? No. Draco's eyes were wide, the pupils blown so large the grey was merely a rim. He looked toward the boarded window, his expression twisting into a snarl. Not the Ministry. Smells like sulphur, rotting meat, burnt sugar. He looked at her, and for the first time there was genuine fear in his face. Not for himself, but for the situation. Hunters. Before Hermione could process the word, the world exploded. The front door didn't open. It disintegrated. A blast of concussive force blew the heavy oak inward, sending splinters of wood flying like shrapnel. Hermione was thrown backward, her shield charm rising on instinct. Protego, absorbing the brunt of the impact, but knocking the wind out of her. Smoke billowed into the room, thick and acrid. Through the haze, 3 figures stepped in. They weren't auras. They wore mismatched leather armor, masks made of bone and iron, and they moved with the heavy, confident swagger of men who enjoyed their work. "Found you, little doggy," the leader grunted. His voice was mechanically amplified, booming in the small space. He held a wand in one hand and a serrated silver knife in the other. Hermione scrambled to her feet, coughing. "Stupefy! Expelliarmus!" Her spells hit the leader's shield and fizzled harmlessly. These were professionals. They had come prepared for a witch. "Take the girl alive if you can," the leader said lazily, deflecting another curse. The boss might want a word with the thief, but the wolf, cripple him. Break the legs first. The other 2 men advanced. Draco was on his feet, straining against the chain. The iron pipe rattled violently against the wall. He let out a roar, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury that shook the floorboards. He lunged at the nearest hunter, his fingers hooked into claws, but the chain jerked him back, choking him. "Look at him!" one of the hunters laughed, stepping just out of range. "Still thinks he's dangerous on a leash." He raised his wand. Crucio. Draco convulsed. He dropped to his knees, screaming, a raw, tearing sound that scraped against Hermione's soul. "No!" Hermione screamed. She turned her wand not on the hunters, but on the room. "Confringo!" The floorboards beneath the hunters exploded, sending them stumbling. But there were too many of them. A jet of purple light hit Hermione in the shoulder. Her arm went numb, her wand clattering to the floor. She fell, gasping, her vision swimming. The leader stepped over her, kicking her wand away. He loomed over her, the bone mask terrifying in the flickering light of the burning furniture. "Stupid little girl," he sneered. "You don't steal from the syndicate." Across the room, Draco was fighting the aftershocks of the torture curse. He was panting, drool mixed with blood dripping from his chin. He saw Hermione fall. He saw the man standing over her, raising the knife. Something in Draco broke. Or perhaps something was completed. "Granger!" he howled. "The chain! Cut the chain!" Hermione looked at him through the haze of pain. She saw his eyes. There was no humanity left in them, only a desperate, calculating violence. If she let him loose, she wasn't releasing a wizard. She was releasing the weapon the arena had built. The leader raised the knife higher. Hermione didn't think. She reached for her wand with her good hand, fingers scrambling in the dust. She gripped the wood. She didn't aim at the attacker. She aimed at the iron pipe. "Diffindo!" The spell sliced through the metal. The chain fell slack. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The sound of the metal hitting the floor was the only warning the hunters got. Then, the blur of motion. Draco didn't cast a spell. He didn't look for a wand. He launched himself across the room with a speed that defied physics. He hit the leader like a cannonball, tackling him away from Hermione. The sound of the impact was wet and crunchy. They crashed into the far wall. The hunter tried to stab him, but Draco caught the man's wrist. There was a sickening snap. The hunter screamed, dropping the knife. Draco didn't stop. He slammed the man's head against the floorboards. Once, twice, 3 times. The screaming stopped. The other 2 hunters panicked. "Kill it! Kill the beast!" Green light flashed, Avada Kedavra. But Draco was already moving. He was low to the ground, moving on all 4s, dodging the curse by a hair's breadth. He was under the guard of the second hunter before the man could cast again. Hermione pressed herself against the wall, eyes wide, paralyzed by the scene. It was a massacre. Draco fought with a terrifying, brutal efficiency. He used his teeth. He used the broken chain still dangling from his wrist as a flail, whipping it around to wrap around the second hunter's neck. He pulled. The man choked, clawing at the iron, his face turning purple. Draco yanked hard, and the man crumpled. The third hunter turned to run. He scrambled for the door, abandoning his comrades. Draco didn't let him. He leaped over the wreckage of the table, landing on the man's back. They went down in a tangle of limbs. Hermione looked away. She squeezed her eyes shut and covered her ears, but she couldn't block out the sounds. The snarling, the tearing of fabric and flesh, the silence that followed. It was over in less than 2 minutes. The safe house was a ruin. The air was thick with the smell of blood, fresh, hot and metallic, and the ozone of dark magic. Hermione opened her eyes slowly. The room was still. The three intruders lay motionless on the floor. In the center of the devastation stood Draco. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving like a bellows. His shirt was in tatters. He was covered in blood, splattered across his chest, soaking his hands up to the forearms, smeared across his pale face. He stood with his back to her, his head lowered, his shoulders hunched. The tension in his body was immense, vibrating like a plucked wire. "Draco?" Hermione whispered. Her voice was trembling so badly the name was barely audible. He flinched. Slowly, agonizingly, he turned around. He looked monstrous. The blood on his mouth made him look like he had just feasted. His eyes were wild, darting around the room, assessing threats that were no longer there. His hands were curled into claws, dripping onto the floorboards. Drip, drip, drip. He looked at Hermione. He saw the fear in her eyes. He saw the way she was pressed against the wall, clutching her injured shoulder. The wildness in his eyes flickered, replaced instantly by a crushing, devastating shame. The adrenaline crashed. The monster receded, leaving behind a horrified man in a butcher's shop. He took a step back, then another. "Don't!" he rasped. His voice was wrecked. "Don't look." He backed away until he hit the far wall, as far from her as he could get. He held his bloody hands up, staring at them, then hid them behind his back, as if hiding the evidence would undo the violence. "I told you," he whispered, sliding down the wall until he was crouching on the floor, making himself small. "I told you what I was." Hermione stared at him. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but the fear was shifting. It was morphing into shock, and then recognition. He hadn't attacked her. In the chaos, in the bloodlust, he had steered every ounce of violence away from her. He had broken the chain not to escape, but to stand between her and the knife. She looked at the bodies of the men who had come to drag him back to the cage. Then she looked at Draco, shivering in the corner, covered in their blood, waiting for her to scream, waiting for her to stun him, waiting for her to realize she had made a mistake. Hermione pushed herself up. Her legs were shaky. Her shoulder burned like fire. She didn't reach for her wand. She took a step toward him. "Stay back," Draco snarled, baring his teeth. It was a bluff. There was no threat in it, only panic. "I'm dangerous. I can't switch it off yet. Stay back, Granger." "You saved me," she said. Her voice was stronger now. "I slaughtered them," he corrected, shaking his head violently. "That wasn't magic. That was the animal. That was the pit." "They were going to kill us," Hermione said, taking another step. She navigated around the broken furniture, around the bodies. "I liked it," he choked out, squeezing his eyes shut, tears cutting tracks through the blood on his face. "For a second, I liked it. That's what I am. I'm a killer." Hermione stopped 3 feet away from him. She knelt down, ignoring the ruin of her robes, ignoring the blood on the floor. She was on his level now. "Draco," she said softly. He refused to open his eyes. He was shaking again, the tremors of the aftermath. "Look at me." He shook his head. "Draco." He opened his eyes. They were wet, grey, and terrified. "You are not a killer," she said fiercely. "You are a survivor, and you are my partner. Thank you." The words hung in the air, absurd and undeniable. "Thank you." Draco stared at her, his mouth opening slightly, unable to process the gratitude. He expected revulsion. He expected her to run. He didn't know what to do with her acceptance. "You're bleeding," he whispered, his gaze dropping to her shoulder. "So are you," she said. She reached out her good hand. She didn't touch him yet. She gave him the choice. She held her palm open, hovering in the space between them. Draco looked at her hand. It was clean, small, steady. It was the antithesis of everything he was in this moment. "I'll dirty you," he warned. "I can wash," she replied. With a shuddering breath, Draco slowly brought one of his hands out from behind his back. It was trembling violently. He hesitated, then placed his blood-stained fingers into her palm. Hermione closed her fingers around his. The contact was warm, sticky, and shockingly real. She didn't pull away. She squeezed his hand, anchoring him to the room, to the moment, to her. "We need to go," she said quietly. "More will come." "Yes," he said, his voice hollow. "More always come." But he didn't let go of her hand. In the wreckage of the safe house, amidst the bodies of his tormentors, the beast held onto the girl, and for the first time, he didn't feel the phantom weight of the cage around him. He felt only her grip. The apparition took them to the edge of the world. They materialized on a narrow strip of rocky beach, hemmed in by towering black cliffs and the churning grey expanse of the North Sea. The wind here was a physical assault, stripping the warmth from their bodies instantly, but it was clean. It scoured the smell of sulphur and death from their nostrils, replacing it with salt and freezing spray. Hermione stumbled as she landed, her knees buckling. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the fight was evaporating, leaving behind a sharp, blinding pain in her shoulder where the curse had hit. "Sit." Draco's voice was harsh, close to her ear. He didn't wait for her to comply. He gripped her uninjured arm and guided her down onto a flat slab of slate, shielded slightly by an overhang of the cliff face. Hermione gasped, clutching her shoulder. Her robes were torn, the fabric soaked with blood that was dark and sluggish. "The bleeding. I need to stop it." "I know," Draco said. He was standing over her, vibrating with residual energy. In the pale, overcast light, he looked like a spectre of war. The blood of the hunters was drying on his skin, flaking off in dark patches. His chest was bare, heaving with every breath, the scars on his torso standing out in high relief against the pallor of his skin. He looked at his hands. They were stained crimson. He rubbed them against his trousers, a frantic scrubbing motion, but the stain was too deep. "I can't," he muttered, backing away. "I can't touch you, not with these." "Draco," Hermione gritted out, the pain making her vision swim. "I can't reach the wound. It's on the back of the deltoid. You have to do it." "I'm not a healer," he snapped, his eyes wild. "I'm a butcher. You saw what I did. You saw it." "I saw you save my life," she countered, her voice weak but firm. She reached into her beaded bag with trembling fingers, pulling out a bottle of Dittany and a clean bandage. She held them out to him. "Wash your hands in the sea. Then help me, please." Draco stared at the bottle. He looked at her, then at the crashing waves. He let out a sound that was half snarl, half sob, and turned toward the water. He walked into the surf without hesitation, the freezing water swirling around his calves. He scrubbed his hands violently, using the sand from the bottom to scour his skin. He washed his arms, his face, splashing the icy water over his head to shock the madness out of his system. When he turned back, he was shivering, his skin red from the cold and the friction, but the blood was gone. He walked back to her, water dripping from his hair onto his bare shoulders. He knelt in the sand beside her. "Give it here," he said, his voice flat. He took the dittany. His hands were shaking, not with fear, but with the tremors of a predator coming down from a kill. He uncorked the bottle. "Turn around." Hermione shifted, turning her back to him. She hissed as the movement pulled at the torn flesh. She felt the cold air hit her skin as Draco carefully peeled back the ruined fabric of her robes. "It's deep," he murmured. The clinical assessment was a shield, a way to distance himself from the reality that he was touching her. The curse tore the muscle. It missed the bone, but barely. "Just pour it," she whispered, gripping the edge of the stone with her good hand. He tipped the bottle. The essence sizzled as it hit the wound. Hermione cried out, her back arching involuntarily. The pain was blinding, white-hot, before it settled into a dull, throbbing ache as the magic began to knit the flesh back together. "Sorry," Draco breathed. "Sorry." His fingers brushed her skin. They were freezing cold, rough with calluses and scars, but his touch was shockingly gentle. He smoothed the edges of the wound, guiding the magic. He wasn't the beast now. He was precise, careful. Hermione shivered. It wasn't from the pain. It was the sensation of him. This man who had just torn 3 men apart with his bare hands, touching her with such reverence. "You're shaking," she said softly. "The wolf is still close," he admitted, his voice a low rumble against her back. He began to wrap the bandage around her shoulder, his arms circling her to pass the linen back and forth. "It wants to run. It wants to hunt. Being this still, it hurts." "Then why are you doing it?" He paused, his hands resting on her shoulders for a moment, the bandage secured. He rested his forehead against the back of her uninjured shoulder. He was burning hot again, his metabolism running high to repair his own fatigue. "Because you asked," he whispered, "and because I don't want you to bleed anymore." Hermione turned around slowly. Draco didn't pull away. He was kneeling between her legs, his face inches from hers. The proximity was suffocating, intense. The air between them felt thin, charged with the ozone of accidental magic and the metallic tang of remaining blood. She looked at him. Really looked at him. The lines of exhaustion around his mouth, the way his wet lashes clumped together, the stark vulnerability in his grey eyes. He wasn't the boy she had hated at school. He wasn't the monster the ministry had created. He was just a man who had been hurt over and over and was waiting for the next blow. "You didn't leave me," she said, searching his face. "You could have run. When the chain broke, you could have left me to them and disappeared." "I thought about it," he said. The honesty was brutal. "For a second, the door was open." "Why didn't you?" Draco's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. He looked tormented. "Because the only thing worse than the cage," he rasped, "is the silence without you." Hermione felt her breath hitch. The world narrowed down to the sound of the ocean and the beat of her own heart. She reached up. Her hand cupped his cheek. His stubble scratched her palm. His skin was cold, but the heat beneath it was undeniable. He froze. He leaned into her touch, his eyes fluttering shut. A small broken sound escaped his throat, a sound of sheer want. "Draco," she whispered. He opened his eyes. The hunger in them was naked now. It wasn't the hunger for food or violence. It was a starving, desperate need for connection, for proof that he existed, that he was seen. "Granger," he warned, his voice cracking. "Don't. I'm not safe. I taste like blood. I don't care. She leaned forward. Draco didn't move to meet her, but he didn't pull away. He held his breath, his whole body rigid. She brushed her lips against his. It wasn't a soft kiss. It wasn't tentative. It was a collision. Draco broke. A low groan vibrated in his chest, and his hands came up, tangling in her hair, gripping the back of her neck. He pulled her against him, crashing his mouth onto hers. It was desperate. It was messy. It tasted of salt spray, iron, and fear. It was the kiss of two people who had just survived the end of the world. He kissed her like he was drowning, and she was the only air left. His teeth grazed her lower lip, sharp and dangerous, but he held back the bite. His tongue swept into her mouth, claiming, searing. Hermione wrapped her good arm around his neck, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to him. She felt the scars on his back under her fingertips, the ridge of his spine. She felt the power in his muscles, the lethal strength he was holding in check just for her. This wasn't romance. This was exorcism. He was pouring all his shame, all his rage, all his fear into her, and she was taking it, meeting it with her own fire. She was telling him without words that she wasn't afraid, that she knew what he was, and she wanted him anyway. Draco pulled back abruptly, gasping for air, his forehead resting against hers. His eyes were wild, searching hers frantically. "Tell me to stop," he pleaded, his voice ragged. "Tell me to stop before I can't." "No," Hermione whispered, her lips swollen, her eyes fierce. "Do not stop." He made a sound like a dying man finding water. He kissed her again, harder this time, his hands sliding down her back, gripping her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. The cold wind whipped around them, the sea roared, but neither of them noticed. In the shelter of the cliff, amidst the ruin of their lives, they clung to each other. It was a raw, visceral affirmation. "I am here. You are here. We are not dead." Draco's hand moved to her throat, his thumb tracing the pulse point. He didn't squeeze. He just held it, feeling the rhythm of her life against his skin. "You're crazy," he murmured against her mouth, his voice thick with emotion. "You're absolutely insane, Granger." "I know," she breathed. He kissed her jaw, her neck, burying his face in the crook of her shoulder. He inhaled her scent, mud, sweat, and magic, trying to overwrite the memory of the cage. "I won't go back," he whispered into her skin. The words were a vow. "I will die before I go back to a cage." Hermione pulled back slightly, forcing him to look at her. Her brown eyes were hard, determined. "You aren't going back," she said. "And you aren't dying. We are going to finish this." Draco looked at her, and for the first time since she had found him in the arena, the grey in his eyes wasn't dead. It was stormy. It was alive. "How?" he asked. "We're fugitives. The Syndicate will hunt us. The Ministry will hunt us." "Let them come," Hermione said, wiping a smudge of blood from his cheek with her thumb. "We have something they don't." "What's that?" "We have nothing left to lose," she lied. She had everything to lose. She was holding him. Draco seemed to understand the lie. He took her hand, the one that had caressed his face, and brought it to his lips. He kissed her knuckles one by one, watching her over his hand. It was a gesture of old-world chivalry that looked jarringly out of place on a half-naked, scarred werewolf in a cave. "Then we fight," he said. The shift was complete. The victim was gone. The beast was leashed. What remained was Draco Malfoy, dangerous, broken, and entirely hers. And that, Hermione realized with a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold, might be the most terrifying thing of all. The coast was a graveyard of sharp rocks and grey water, but it was the silence that felt most dangerous. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held breath before the plunge. Hermione and Draco moved inland, away from the exposure of the beach. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say that hadn't been said in the desperate, salt-tasted kiss against the cliff face. They were alive, but they were hunted. Draco moved with a limp, his body finally registering the toll of the berserker drugs leaving his system. He stayed close to her, not out of fear, but out of a new magnetic gravity. He was the shadow at her shoulder, his eyes scanning the horizon, the ridgeline, the sky. "We need cover," Hermione whispered, clutching her healed but aching shoulder. "There's a forest past the ridge. If we can make the tree line, the anti-apparition wards might be weaker." "They're not tracking us by magic," Draco rasped. He stopped, sniffing the air. The wind had shifted, bringing a scent that made his lip curl. "They're tracking the blood, and the signature of the collar." He tapped the side of his neck. There was no physical collar, but the magical brand, the rune of possession, pulsed faintly beneath his skin. "I can mask it," Hermione said, raising her wand. "Too late," Draco said. His voice was dead calm. He looked up at the ridge. The air shimmered. It wasn't the chaotic crack of a portkey or the violent tear of unauthorized apparition. It was the synchronized, polite pop-pop-pop of ministry arrivals. 6 figures materialized on the crest of the hill. They were silhouetted against the grey sky, their robes crisp, their posture upright. They didn't look like hunters. They looked like order. They looked like the law. In the center stood Gawain Robards, the head of the Aura Office. Flanking him were 4 hit wizards and a man in the grey, sterile robes of the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. "Granger!" Robards called out. His voice was magically amplified, booming down the slope like a god passing judgment. "Step away from the subject." Hermione froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was it. The system she had served, the world she had bled for, had finally caught up. Draco stiffened. He didn't growl. He didn't shift. He simply straightened his spine, pushing down the animal instinct to crouch. He stepped slightly in front of her, a human shield made of scar tissue and defiance. "No," Hermione said. Her voice wasn't amplified, but in the bowl of the valley it carried. Robards descended the slope with a practiced, easy stride. The hit wizards kept their wands trained on Draco, the tips glowing with lethal red light. "We received the signal from the arena," Robards said, stopping 10 yards away. He looked at Hermione with a disappointed, paternal expression that made her stomach turn. "Excellent work, Hermione. Truly. You flushed out the Syndicate's operation. We've already secured the site. The arrests are being made as we speak." Hermione stared at him. "Arrests?" "The ringleaders." Robards nodded. "Highly illegal what they were doing. Unlicensed dueling, tax evasion. We'll shut it all down." His eyes slid to Draco. The paternal warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, clinical assessment. He looked at Draco not as a man, but as a dangerous object that had been retrieved. "And you secured the asset," Robards continued. "Subject 7 Alpha, Draco Malfoy, presumed dead. I must say, it's a surprise to see him functional." "He is not an asset," Hermione said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "He is a victim. He was kidnapped, tortured, and forced to fight. He is a Class X non-being," the man in the grey robes interrupted. He held a clipboard, his quill hovering over the parchment. "Unregistered lycanthrope with a history of extreme violence. According to the arena logs, he's responsible for 34 deaths in the last 6 months." "In self-defense," Hermione shouted. "It doesn't matter," Robard sighed. He sounded weary, as if her morality was a paperwork error he had to correct. "The law is clear, Hermione. Once a creature has tasted human blood to that extent, they are considered irredeemable. He's a liability to public safety." Draco let out a dry, bitter laugh. It was a terrifying sound. "Irredeemable," he echoed. He looked at Hermione. "I told you. The cage changes, but the lock is the same." Robards ignored him. He took a step toward Hermione, extending a hand. "Come here, Hermione. You're injured. You're in shock. You've been undercover in a dark place, and it's clouded your judgment." He smiled, a tight, thin stretching of lips. "The minister is impressed. There's a promotion waiting on my desk. Senior Undersecretary. You'll have the power to write the laws, Hermione. You can make sure these arenas never happen again. You can save hundreds of them." He gestured vaguely at Draco. "But you have to let us handle this one. He's the evidence. He's the weapon. We can't just let a feral werewolf walk away. It's messy." The offer hung in the air. It was everything she had ever worked for. Power, influence, the ability to change the system from the inside. All she had to do was step forward. All she had to do was let the machinery of the ministry do what it was designed to do. Grind the difficult things into dust. "Draco," the grey-robed official said, "if you surrender quietly, we can offer a humane termination. Painless, dignified. Or, if you prefer, life containment in the secure wing at Azkaban. No fighting. Just sleep." Draco looked at the official, then he looked at Hermione. The fight drained out of him. He didn't look scared anymore. He looked tired. "Go, Granger," he whispered. He nudged her gently with his elbow. "Take the deal. You can't fix this if you're in a cell next to me." "Shut up," she hissed. "They're right," Draco said, his voice cracking. "I killed them. I liked it. You saw me. I'm not the boy you went to school with. I'm the thing that comes out in the dark." He stepped away from her. He held his hands out toward Robards, wrists together, waiting for the chains. "I surrender," Draco said clearly. "Let her go." Robards nodded, satisfied. "Smart lad. See, Hermione? Even he knows where he belongs." Hermione looked at Draco's back. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his head was bowed. She saw the surrender. He was doing the one thing he knew how to do, sacrifice himself to the cage so she wouldn't have to watch him bleed. She looked at Robards. She looked at the polished wands of the hit wizards. She realized then that the monster wasn't the man with the wolf in his blood. The monster was the man in the clean robes who called murder processing. "No," Hermione said. She didn't shout it. She said it with the quiet, terrifying finality of a judge passing a sentence. Robards blinked. "Excuse me." "I said no." Hermione reached into her pocket. She pulled out her ministry badge, the silver M she had polished every morning for 3 years. She looked at it, seeing her own reflection in the metal. "You want the evidence?" she asked. She threw the badge. It hit the rocks at Robards' feet with a metallic clink. "There's your evidence," she said. "I am resigning." "Hermione, Be reasonable, Robard snapped, his patience fraying. You are throwing away your life for a Death Eater. For a beast. He is not a beast, Hermione screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. He is a man, and he has more humanity in his little finger than you have in your entire department. She grabbed Draco's arm. He looked at her, stunned, his grey eyes wide with disbelief. Granger, he breathed. What are you doing? I'm making a choice, she said. She raised her wand, not at Robard's, but at the cliff face above them. Bombarda Maxima. The spell hit the overhang. The cliff groaned. Tons of slate and granite cracked, separated, and began to slide. Shields! Robards roared, diving back. The landslide crashed down between them, a curtain of dust and thunder. It didn't kill the auras. Hermione wasn't a murderer, but it severed the path. It created a wall of debris 20 feet high, blocking the line of sight, blocking the spells. For a moment, there was only the sound of falling rock and the choking cloud of dust. Hermione coughed, waving her hand to clear the air. She was covered in grey dust. She turned to Draco. He was standing perfectly still, staring at the wall of rock that now separated them from the world. He looked at the blockage, then he turned his head slowly to look at her. His expression was shattered. You ended it, he whispered. Your career, your reputation. They'll brand you a traitor. They'll hunt you. I know, Hermione said. She lowered her wand, her hand shaking now that the deed was done. Why? Draco took a step toward her, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and awe. I gave you an out. I gave you a future. Why would you burn it all down for me? Because Hermione walked up to him, invading his space, forcing him to look her in the eye. I don't want a future where you don't exist, Draco. She reached out and took his face in her hands. His skin was gritty with dust, but he was warm. He was real. I choose you, she said, fierce and low. I choose the beast, because the beast didn't lie to me. The beast didn't use me. The beast saved me. Draco stared at her, his lips parted, his breath hitching in his chest. A tear cut a clean track through the dust on his cheek. He crumbled. The stoicism, the sarcasm, the walls he had built for 3 years, they all collapsed. He fell to his knees in the dirt, wrapping his arms around her waist, burying his face in her stomach. He sobbed. It wasn't a pretty sound. It was the ugly, wrenching sound of a man who had been holding his breath for an eternity and was finally allowed to exhale. Hermione dropped to her knees with him. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders, holding him tight, rocking him slightly. I've got you, she whispered into his hair. I see you. You're not alone. Draco clung to her, his fingers digging into her back, as if she were the only solid thing in a dissolving universe. They'll come back, he gasped, his voice muffled by her robes. They'll bring more. Let them, Hermione said, looking at the wall of rock. Her eyes were cold, hard, and absolutely clear. We'll be ready. She pulled back slightly, lifting his chin. His eyes were red, raw, and open. For the first time, there was no shame in them, only a fierce, terrifying devotion. Can you walk? She asked. Draco nodded. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, sniffing. He stood up, offering her his hand. Where do we go? He asked. We have nowhere. We have the unknown, Hermione said, taking his hand. She squeezed his fingers. He squeezed back, hard enough to bruise, holding on for dear life. They turned away from the blockage, away from the ministry, away from the order and the laws and the safety of the cage. They walked toward the dark forest line, two silhouettes against the gathering storm. They were outlaws now, monsters in the eyes of the world. But as Draco fell into step beside her, matching her stride, Hermione felt a strange, wild peace settle over her. She hadn't just saved him. She had saved herself. The path ahead was dark, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't walking it alone. The cabin did not exist on any map. It sat deep within the black forest, a jagged splinter of timber and stones swallowed by the pines. The air here was thin and smelled of resin and old snow. There were no wards to alert the ministry, no magical signatures to track. Just the silence of the trees and the heavy, persistent cold. 3 months had passed since the cliffside collapsed. Hermione stood by the rough-hewn table, her hands deep in the gut of a rabbit. She was skinning it. Her movements were efficient, stripped of the squeamishness that had once defined her. The knife was sharp, a muggle blade, because using magic to slice meat felt like a waste of a magical core they needed to conserve. The door opened, letting in a gust of freezing wind and the pale grey light of the afternoon. Draco entered. He carried an armful of logs, his breath puffing in white clouds. He kicked the door shut with his heel. He was bearded now, a short, rough growth of platinum blonde that hid the sharpness of his jaw, but emphasized the hollowness of his cheeks. He wore a heavy coat they had stolen from a drying line in a muggle village 2 weeks ago. He dropped the wood by the hearth with a heavy thud. "Storm's coming," he said. His voice was still a rasp, permanently damaged by the screaming in the arena. He didn't look at her. He looked at the fire, checking the embers. "We have enough wood," Hermione said, not looking up from her task. "And the cellar is reinforced." At the mention of the cellar, Draco went still. The tension that lived in his shoulders, a permanent coiled spring, tightened. Tonight was the moon. It was no longer a secret catastrophe. It was a schedule. It was a chore. It was the price of rent for being alive. Draco walked over to the table. He didn't offer to help. He knew she preferred to do it herself. It gave her hands something to do. Instead, he stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him. The wolf was close to the surface now. She could smell it on him, a musk that was sharper than sweat, electric and dangerous. "You should leave for the night," he said. It was the same argument he started every month. "Go to the village. Stay in the inn." "No," Hermione said, slicing through a tendon. "The cellar isn't the arena, Granger. The walls are wood and stone. If I breach them, you won't. You don't know that." He reached out, his hand gripping her wrist, stopping the knife. His grip was too hard. His fingers were rough, calloused, the nails slightly too long. "I don't know who I am when the bone breaks. I don't know you when it happens. To the wolf, you're just meat." Hermione set the knife down. She turned in his grip, not pulling away. She looked up at him. His eyes were already changing. The grey was bleeding into amber, the pupils restless and dilated. He looked terrified. Not of the pain. He had made friends with pain long ago, but of the potential for violence against her. "I am not meat," she said, her voice level, cutting through his panic. "And you are not just a wolf. You built that cellar yourself, Draco. You welded the hinges. You carved the runes. You built a cage to keep me safe. A beast doesn't do that. A man does." He stared at her, his chest heaving. He wanted to believe her, but the memories of the pit, of the blood on his hands, were a constant noise in his head. "I ruined you," he whispered. He lifted a hand to touch her face, but stopped, curling his fingers into a fist. "Look at you, skinning rabbits in a shack. You should be in the ministry. You should be wearing silk. You should be clean." Hermione looked down at her hands. They were stained with blood. Her fingernails were broken. Her robes were a patchwork of mending charms. "I was never clean, Draco," she said softly. "I just hid the dirt better." She reached out and took his fist, uncurling his fingers one by one until his palm rested against her cheek. "I made my choice," she said. "I'm not a victim. I'm an accomplice. Get used to it." Draco let out a shuddering breath, leaning his forehead against hers. "You're a fool," he murmured. But he didn't pull away. He held on to her as if she were the tether keeping him from drifting into the abyss. The sun set early, bleeding behind the pines in a bruise of purple and black. The transformation was starting. Draco was pacing the small main room of the cabin, his skin pale and clammy, sweat beading on his forehead. His joints were popping audibly as the skeletal structure began to shift. "Time," Hermione said. It wasn't a question. Draco nodded grimly. He stripped off his shirt, tossing it onto the chair. His torso was a map of violence. The arena scars, the curse marks, the healed wounds from their escape. But there were new marks too. The bruises of hard labor, the small cuts of a life lived in the wild. He walked to the heavy oak door in the floor. He pulled it open, revealing the dark stone steps leading down. He paused at the edge of the pit. He looked back at her. "Lock it," he rasped, his voice warping, deepening into a growl. 2 bolts, then the silencing charm. Don't listen to it." "Go," Hermione said. He descended. Hermione followed him to the top of the stairs. She watched him walk into the darkness of the cellar. He went to the far corner where he had bolted heavy chains into the bedrock. He didn't chain himself. He refused to be bound like he was in the arena, but he sat there, curling into a ball, waiting for the break. She closed the heavy trapdoor. She slid the first iron bolt. Clack. She slid the second. Clack. She picked up her wand to cast the silencing charm. She hesitated. The tip of her wand hovered over the wood. Down below, the first scream tore through the air. It was a sound of absolute bone-breaking agony. It was the sound of a human being unmade. Hermione lowered her wand. She didn't cast the charm. She wouldn't silence him. The ministry had silenced him. The arena had silenced him. She would not. She would bear witness to his pain because it was the only thing she could share with him. She sat down on the floor, her back resting against the trapdoor. The wood vibrated against her spine as the creature below slammed against the walls. She could hear the snarling, the scratching of claws against stone, the mindless, rage-filled howls of a predator trapped in the dark. She pulled her knees to her chest and opened her book. Not a storybook this time, but a text on defensive wards she was writing herself. She read aloud. "The principle of the shield is not to block," she read, her voice steady, pitching it to carry through the floorboards, "but to absorb, to take the energy of the attack and disperse it." Below, the howling paused, a heavy snuffing sound. The wolf could hear her. "We do not break," Hermione read, changing the text, speaking to the floor. "We endure, we reshape, and when the morning comes, we remain." A low whine drifted up through the cracks. It was a lonely, aching sound. Hermione placed her hand flat against the wood of the trapdoor. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm right here." The scratching stopped. The wolf settled near the door, directly beneath her. She could feel its presence, a heavy heat pressing up against the barrier. They sat like that for hours, the monster in the dark and the witch in the light, separated by 6 inches of oak and a world of prejudice. Morning arrived in a wash of cold white light. The silence from the cellar was profound. Hermione unlocked the bolts. Her fingers were stiff with cold. She heaved the trapdoor open. The smell hit her first, musk and blood. Draco had torn his own skin in the night, scratching at the phantom brands of the arena. He was lying on the stone floor, naked, human again. He was curled in a fetal position, shivering violently, covered in dust and dried blood. Hermione didn't hesitate. She climbed down the stairs. She didn't have potions. She didn't have a healer's kit. She had a bucket of warm water she had heated on the fire and a rough towel. She knelt beside him. "Draco!" He flinched, his eyes flying open. They were grey again, dull, exhausted, but grey. He looked at her, then scrambled backward, pressing his back against the cold stone wall. He tried to cover himself, shame flooding his expression. "Don't," he croaked. "I'm filthy." "You're alive," she said. She dipped the towel in the water. She reached out. "Let me," she said. He watched her, his chest heaving. He looked at the towel, then at her face. He was waiting for the disgust. He was always waiting for the disgust. But Hermione's face held only a grim, quiet determination. She wasn't a savior anymore. She wasn't a glowing angel of mercy. She was a woman who knew exactly what darkness looked like and chose to sit in it. She wiped the blood from his shoulder. She cleaned the dirt from his face. "Why?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "Why do you stay? There is no future here. Just this, cold and blood and hiding." Hermione stopped. She rinsed the towel, the water turning pink. "Do you remember what you said in the arena?" she asked. "That they made you a beast?" He nodded, looking away. "They didn't," she said. "They just stripped away the lies. The manners, the robes, the family name. They took all of it away." She placed her wet, warm hand on his chest, directly over his heart. She could feel it beating, slow, strong, enduring. "And this is what was left," she said. "This is what survived. I don't love the Malfoy heir, Draco. I don't love the boy on the broomstick. I love the thing that survived the cage." Draco looked at her, his eyes filled with tears, hot and fast. He didn't fight them this time. He reached up and covered her hand with his own. His grip was weak, trembling, but he held on. "I'm not good," he choked out. "I'm never going to be good." "I don't need you to be good," Hermione said, leaning forward until their foreheads touched. The damp air of the cellar closed around them, intimate and stark. "I just need you to be here." He let out a sob, a broken sound of surrender, and leaned into her. He buried his face in her neck, breathing her in, replacing the scent of the wolf with the scent of her. "I'm here," he whispered into her skin. "I'm here." Hermione wrapped her arms around him, holding his shivering body against hers. She looked up at the square of light coming from the trapdoor above. The world outside would call this a tragedy. They would call him a monster and her a traitor. They would say she had fallen. But as Hermione held the man who had clawed his way back from hell just to sit on a cold stone floor with her, she knew the truth. Justice was a concept for courtrooms. Redemption was a story for books. This, the warmth of his skin, the beat of his heart, the shared breath in the quiet dark, this was the only thing that was real. Draco lifted his head. He looked at her, really looked at her, with a clarity that seared. He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't hungry or desperate. It was slow. It was a seal. It tasted of iron and salt, but mostly it tasted of life. "Get up," she whispered against his lips. "Coffee is ready." Draco let out a huff of laughter, a rusty, genuine sound. "Bossy. Always." He stood up, groaning as his muscles protested, and pulled her up with him. He didn't let go of her hand. They climbed the stairs together, leaving the dark behind, stepping up into the harsh, blinding light of a day that promised nothing but survival. And it was enough. Monsters are created long before they are locked in cages, Hermione thought as she watched him walk into the light. But sometimes, if you are very lucky, they learn how to break the bars from the inside. She closed the trap door. Click. The cage was empty. Time did not heal. It weathered. It smoothed the sharpest edges of the trauma, like the sea smoothing broken glass, turning jagged shards into something that could be held without drawing blood, though it remained cold and hard to the touch. 5 years had passed since the landslide on the coast. The Black Forest had swallowed them whole. To the wizarding world, they were a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of the Aura Department, the fallen heroine and the feral beast. Some said they died in the collapse. Others said they were running a dark magic empire in the Alps. The truth was quieter and far more brutal. Hermione stood knee-deep in the snow, the wind biting at her exposed cheeks. She was no longer the girl in the crisp ministry robes. She wore layers of cured leather and heavy wool, her hair braided tight against her skull to keep it from snapping in the gale. She was checking the perimeter wards, not the standard ministry protections, but ancient, blood-based runic webs she had developed herself. She felt the vibration in the soles of her boots before she heard the sound. A crack, the snapping of a branch under a heavy boot. Hermione didn't panic. She didn't even reach for her wand immediately. She simply exhaled, her breath pluming white in the freezing air, and turned her head toward the dense thicket of pines to her left. "You're loud," she called out. Her voice was calm, pitched low to carry under the wind. "And you're downwind. He smelled you 3 miles ago." Silence stretched for a moment, heavy and expectant. Then a figure stepped out from the trees. It was a man, young, barely 20. He wore the dark blue robes of a specialized tracking unit, the silver insignia on his chest gleaming new and unblemished. He held his wand raised, his hand shaking slightly. He looked terrified. "Hermione Granger?" he asked, his voice cracking on the syllables. Hermione looked him over. He was a child sent to do a job that had killed seasoned veterans. "That name doesn't mean much out here," she said. "Turn around. Walk back the way you came. If you cross the tree line, I can't stop him." I have orders," the boy stammered, trying to summon authority he didn't possess. "I am Aura Finch. I am here to arrest the fugitive Draco Malfoy for crimes against—" A shadow detached itself from the gloom of the trees behind the boy. It moved with a silence that was unnatural. One moment the space was empty. The next, a massive shape was looming over the Aura's shoulder. Draco. He hadn't aged so much as he had hardened. The boyish sharpness of his face was gone, replaced by a rugged, scarred stoicism. A thick scar ran from his temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a manticore they had crossed in the second year. He wore furs and dark leathers, blending perfectly into the winter landscape. He didn't have a wand in his hand. He held a hunting knife, the blade resting casually against his thigh. "Auror Finch," Draco rasped. His voice was like grinding stones. The boy spun around, gasping, and stumbled back, tripping over a root. He landed hard in the snow, his wand flailing. Draco didn't attack. He just stood there, tilting his head. His eyes were the color of the storm clouds above, grey, flat, and utterly devoid of mercy. He looked at the boy with the curiosity of a wolf inspecting a particularly stupid rabbit. "You're shaking," Draco observed. "You shouldn't hunt predators if you can't hold your hand steady." "Stay back!" Finch yelled, scrambling backward in the snow, pointing his wand at Draco's chest. "I'll cast. I swear I'll cast." Draco smirked. It wasn't the arrogant sneer of his youth. It was a dark, feral expression that showed too many teeth. "Go ahead," Draco said softly. "But remember, I don't need magic to tear your throat out before the light leaves your wand." The threat hung in the air, absolute and suffocating. "Draco," Hermione said. She hadn't moved. She stood 10 feet away, her hands resting in her pockets. She spoke his name quietly, without alarm. Draco's gaze flicked to her. The flat killer instinct in his eyes rippled, softening just around the edges. He didn't step down, but he paused. "He's trespassing, Granger," Draco growled. "He brings the scent of the ministry, the scent of the cage." "He's a child," Hermione corrected. "Look at his boots. Standard issue, thin soles. He's freezing. He didn't track us. He got lucky and stumbled on the outer marker." She walked forward, placing herself between the terrifying figure of Draco and the trembling boy on the ground. "Get up," she commanded the aura. Finch scrambled to his feet, looking between them. He seemed unable to process what he was seeing. He had been told stories of a helpless witch held captive by a monster. He had expected to save a victim. Instead, he saw a woman who looked at the monster, not with fear, but with an intimacy that was terrifying to witness. "Ms. Granger," Finch whispered, You're free. I can help you. We can subdue him. I have a port key." Hermione laughed. It was a dry, sharp sound. "Subdue him? You couldn't subdue him if he was asleep and you had a battalion." She took a step closer to the boy. Her eyes were hard, flashing with a dangerous intelligence. "You think I'm a prisoner?" she asked. "The reports," Finch stammered. "They say he's dangerous, unstable." "He is," Hermione agreed effortlessly. She glanced back at Draco. He was watching her, his body relaxed but ready to spring, trusting her to handle the threat, but ready to end it if she failed. "He is the most dangerous thing in this forest, but you're missing the point." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that chilled Finch more than the wind. "I didn't stay because I was trapped, Auror Finch. I stayed because I am the only one who knows how to run with him without getting eaten. I stayed because out here, the monsters are honest." Finch stared at her, the blood draining from his face. He finally saw it. The way she stood, the coldness in her eyes, the holster on her hip. She wasn't the golden girl anymore. She was part of the wild. "Go," Hermione said, her voice snapping like a whip. "Go back to Robards. Tell him you found nothing. Tell him the woods are empty. Because if you come back, or if you send others..." She didn't finish the threat. She didn't have to. Behind her, Draco took a step forward, and the sound of his boot crunching the snow was like a gunshot. Finch nodded frantically. He backed away, his wand lowered. Yes, nothing, just trees." He turned and ran. He stumbled through the drifts, crashing through the underbrush, desperate to put distance between himself and the couple in the clearing. They watched him go. Draco waited until the sound of the boy's retreat faded into the howling wind. Then the tension drained from his shoulders. He sheathed the knife. He walked over to Hermione. "You let him go," he stated. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. "He won't come back," Hermione said, watching the tree line. "And neither will the others. Fear is a better deterrent than a corpse." "A corpse is quieter," Draco muttered, but he reached out. His hand, rough and scarred, brushed the snow from her shoulder. The gesture was possessive, habitual. He wasn't checking for injuries. He was re-establishing contact. He needed the tactile proof of her presence after the intrusion. "You're cold," he said. "It's winter, Draco. Come inside." They walked back to the cabin. It had grown over the years. Draco had added a second room, a proper chimney, a woodshed. It was sturdy, built of black timber and stone, a fortress against the elements. Inside, the fire was roaring. The air smelled of wood smoke and drying herbs. Draco shed his heavy coat, hanging it by the door. He moved to the hearth, adding a log to the fire, stirring the embers. The orange light danced over his features, highlighting the silver lines of his scars. Hermione sat at the table, unlacing her boots. She felt the fatigue settle in, the adrenaline of the confrontation fading. "He asked if I was a prisoner," she said softly into the silence. Draco froze, the poker in his hand still in the fire. He didn't turn around. "And?" he asked, his voice tight. And I told him the truth. Draco turned slowly. He looked at her across the room. The distance between them was filled with 5 years of shared silence, of nights in the cellar, of hunting in the rain, of stitching each other's wounds. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked. The question was rare. They almost never spoke of the before. The libraries, the applause, the feeling of being right? Hermione stood up. She walked across the room in her stocking feet. She stopped in front of him. "I was never right," she said. "I was just obedient. There is a difference." She reached out and touched the scar on his jaw, tracing the line of it with her thumb. "Do you miss it?" she countered. "The manner? The power?" Draco closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. "I miss nothing," he whispered. "I was a ghost in that manner. I was a weapon in the arena. Here." He opened his eyes. They were clear, intense. "Here, I am just a man who loves a witch." It was a simple confession, stripped of all poetry, and it hit harder than any sonnet. Hermione grabbed the lapels of his tunic and pulled him down. The kiss was slow, deep, and tasting of the fire. It wasn't the desperate collision of their escape, nor the terrified clinging of the early days. It was the kiss of two people who knew the map of each other's souls. It was confident. It was heavy with history. Draco's arms went around her waist, lifting her effortlessly onto the edge of the heavy wooden table. He stepped between her knees, pressing closer, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He inhaled deeply, grounding himself. You're mine, he growled against her skin, the wolf surfacing in the possessiveness of the tone. Let them send armies. Let them send the whole damn ministry. I will burn the forest down around us before I let them take you. Hermione threaded her fingers through his hair, grown longer now, tied back but coming loose. She tugged, forcing his head up so she could look him in the eye. They aren't coming, Draco, she said fiercely. We're the monsters in the dark now, and monsters don't get hunted. They get feared. Draco looked at her, and a slow, crooked smile spread across his face, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. You're terrifying, Granger. I learned from the best. She kissed him again, biting his lower lip, drawing a sharp intake of breath from him. Outside, the storm finally broke, snow burying the world in white, erasing their tracks, erasing the path back to civilization. The wind howled against the walls, trying to get in, trying to freeze them out. But inside, the fire burned hot. Draco lifted her from the table, carrying her toward the bed in the corner of the room. He moved not with the jerky, frenetic energy of the beast, but with the steady, powerful grace of a man who had found his center. They didn't need the world. They didn't need redemption. They had built a sanctuary on the edge of the abyss and found that the abyss was the only place they could breathe. As Draco lowered her onto the furs, shadowing her body with his own, Hermione had one final, fleeting thought of the boy, Aura Finch, running back to a world of rules and laws. She pitied him. He would live a life of safety. He would never know what it was to look into the eyes of a beast and see your own soul reflected back. He would never know the freedom of the cage that had been broken from the inside. Stay, Draco whispered, his lips against her temple. Always, she answered. And the silence of the forest swallowed them, keeping their secret, keeping them safe, forever in the wild.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for listening to my story. This story, In a Cage with a Beast, is very special to me. It is a dark story, but is also about hope. I wanted to ask a simple question. Who is the real monster? Is the wolf or is the cruel world that put him in a cage? In this story, Hermione does not try to fix Draco. She does not to try to change him. She simply sits with him in the dark. She accepts his scares. To me, that is real love. Love is not always soft and easy. Sometimes love is survival. Sometimes love is just holding someone's hand when they are afraid. I hope this story made you feel something. Thank you for being here with me. See you in the next story.